1 Samuel 18. The battle of the Valley of Elah is over. We finished it up 2 weeks ago in 1 Samuel 17. Goliath is killed in verses 50 and 51 of that verse. Knocked down by a stone that sank deep into his forehead and then beheaded with his own sword, because David didn't carry a sword into battle with him, just a shepherd sling, 5 stones, and his staff. The Philistines have been chased west. Remember, the Elah Valley runs east to west across the center of Israel. Bethlehem in the east, Gath in the west, and the children of Israel have chased the Philistines back into their own territory east down the valley. David comes to Saul in verse 57 bearing the head of Goliath, which a rough thing to haul in as a souvenir, but he's going someplace with it. Eventually he'll drop it off. You remember, kind of an unusual place, particularly the name that you use. You remember where he's going to drop the head off? Well, it's headquarters. Jebus, but he's going to drop it off in what's called Jerusalem. Yeah, headquarters. I see what you did there. He's going to drop it off in Jerusalem, right? But Jerusalem didn't exist at the time, right? It was called Jebus. It was owned by the Jebusites, and it wouldn't be called Jerusalem until David took over as king. But we come now, the chapter break interrupts the conversation. The chapter break is not a break in the action. It's just put there, and we just run right past it. There's a lot of continuity here. And we see David and Jonathan. It says in verse 1 of chapter 18, "And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking unto Saul," he just identified who his father is to Saul. "When he had made an end of speaking unto Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him as his own soul." Who's Jonathan?
Saul's son.
Saul's son. Can you give me any more about which son?
Oldest.
The oldest of Saul's sons. So Saul is the king, and his oldest son, who would, in the normal course of kingly events, would become king when his father passed off the throne, he is now knit. His soul is knit with David. And last time we looked at this, we noticed some similarities between the faith of these two men. If you remember, in chapter 14, we saw Jonathan go out to fight the Philistines with just himself and his armor bearer. And they were only armed with the sword that he carried. But he said, as he and his armor bearer went up against a Philistine garrison, which would be in the north of 1,000, probably close to 2,000 perhaps that there were there, he's going up to fight the Philistine garrison, and he says in verse 6 of chapter 14, "For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." God doesn't need an army. God could use me, or God could do it without me. But he's got great faith. David, last chapter, we saw David go out against the Philistine champion. And he tells the champion in verse 47, he says, "And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." This is what he told Goliath. So they have a similar kind of faith. Both men willing to be used by a big and powerful God. And I think that's probably the first thing that kind of drew them to each other. With a common love for Jehovah, their souls are knit, meaning they're bound together. They're joined together. Verse 2 is included almost parenthetically, because verse 1 and verse 3 are talking about David and Jonathan. Verse 2, kind of parenthetically, says, "And Saul took him," David, "that day, and would let him go no more home to his father's house." Now, in chapter 16, David and Saul's paths had crossed for the first time that we have recorded, when Saul was suffering under the effects of the evil spirit. You remember this? The Spirit of the Lord left him, and an evil spirit came upon him. And David played his harp for Saul, and the evil spirit disappeared. And chapter 16, verse 21 says, "And David came to Saul, and stood before him, and Saul, loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer." So a relationship was begun where David is now in the employ, if you want to call it. He's on staff for Saul. He's one of Saul's armor bearers. He's not the exclusive. Kings of this day had more than one. So he's got multiple armor bearers, of which David is one. Because when we come to chapter 17, David wasn't in Saul's camp. David was back in Bethlehem. He was keeping the sheep. Another armor bearer would have rotated on, and David would have rotated off. That was the way that it was handled in this culture. And David would eventually, he would rotate back on, and he would be back in Saul's employ. But following David's victory over Goliath, wouldn't it be a little bit weird to send the man who just won against the big Philistine? Wouldn't it be weird to send him home to the fields to work for Dad? That would be strange. Saul doesn't do that. He brings him in, and Saul likely felt that his reputation would only be enhanced by having David close by. I'm a great man. Let me introduce you to my great servant. This is David. Maybe you've heard of him. He's my armor bearer, and he defeated Goliath. Saul is doubtless beginning to see David as a threat. That's beginning. And I'm gonna make a case to you here this evening. I think that part of this that we read here in verse 2 is Saul operating by the old saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. If I let David go where he lives, Saul is reigning from Gibeah. If I let David go home to Bethlehem, he's got a little bit of a following. He's got some celebrity to him now, and people are going to want to come to see David. I'd just as soon them come here where I can keep an eye on what's going on. I would imagine that that's starting to happen. This conscription of young men is actually what Samuel said would happen. You remember when the children of Israel said, we want a king? Samuel told them in chapter 8, verse 11, he said, this will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons, and he'll point them for himself, for his chariots, for his horsemen. Some shall run before his chariots. So this is just another prophecy fulfilled. Samuel said, look, if you want a king, he's going to take your sons from you. And in this case, Saul has just taken Jesse's youngest son, David. But now we come back to Jonathan and David here in verse 3. So verse 2 just kind of tells us this is where David's going to be living moving forward. Verse 3, then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. A covenant here in this case is the Hebrew word meaning a compact, a pledge of allegiance or a league. Okay? They are binding themselves together by something a little bit more binding than I'll be your best friend till the day that I die. What you remember saying that at a sleepover when you were little with your best friend? We'll be best. When did you last talk to that best friend? Okay, probably not recently. But this is more powerful than that. These are two men who are well established and who are binding themselves one to the other. There's a union here that won't be broken. This covenant is going to show up multiple times in the chapters to come. What they have just now decided upon will shape the course of both of their lives in the chapters to come. It was a pledge to show kindness and extend protection to each other and their families. Jonathan's allegiance to David would save David's life many times, and we'll see that. In 1 Samuel, as we're going through, we're going to see this pledge, this covenant is going to save David multiple times. David took this covenant so seriously that when after Jonathan died in the Battle of Gilboa, then David, when he was established as king, he went looking for Jonathan's family so that he could fulfill the covenant that was made right here in 1 Samuel 18:3. They're serious about this. You remember, David is going to bring a young crippled man, Jonathan's son. You remember his name? Mephibosheth is going to come in, and he's going to be part of David's household. Why would you do that? Why would you bring a cripple into the house of the king? Well, because of a covenant that he made when he was first starting to rise. David's star is just starting to come up, and he makes a covenant that he'll abide by for the rest of his life. Verse 4, more about the covenant, more about their relationship. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was upon him and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, to his bow, and to his girdle. So he gives him the robe that he wears. He gives him his sword, bow, and girdle. These would be the sword belt and all of the weapons that he was wearing. These were the outward symbols of princely power. When Jonathan was walking down the way, you would know who he was. Well, because he's wearing those clothes. He's carrying those weapons, and it would have been well known. And now he takes these things off and he gives them to David. Now, do you think Jonathan knew that his dad had already lost the kingdom? You think he knew? We don't have it written for us. What do you think? I tend to think he did. I think that he was probably privy to some of the conversation that happened between Samuel and his father. I think he probably knew what had happened. He knows that something is going to happen, and perhaps he suspected, or perhaps God told him, because we know that Jonathan did walk with God. Maybe God told him, this is going to be the next king. This is going to be the successor as the Lord's anointed in place of your father. Perhaps Jonathan knew. So what he just did in verse 4, this would take a certain amount of humility. Remember, he's the oldest son of the sitting king. It should have been his. But rather than that, he acknowledges that God's hand is on David. He gives these things to David. This friendship, this union that we have, the covenant that is made, is a tremendously powerful one. Now, because of the setting in which we are, and this being a Bible study type of a setting, I want to take just a moment and I want to make a side note here. This was a godly friendship, what we see here between David and Jonathan. Now, the world, in the day and age in which we live, Isaiah 5:20 speaks of those who call evil good and good evil. And that has been done in the case of David and Jonathan. And so I want to take just a moment. There are those in our culture who look to pervert the relationship of David and Jonathan to say that God approves of a homosexual lifestyle. They would point to David and Jonathan and say, this is proof of what happened. And the reason that they do that is because they take a verse in 2 Samuel chapter 1 and they twist it. Here it is. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 25. This is David mourning after the death of Saul and Jonathan. Okay? This is Saul and Jonathan, both dead, both buried. David is mourning, the first chapter of 2 Samuel. And it says, how are the mighty fallen in the midst of the battle of Gilboa? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thine high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. This is a verse that in our culture is taken, twisted, and perverted to prove as a proof text for an immoral lifestyle. This statement that he is giving right here is not of a sexual nature at all. This, when he says it's wonderful, passing the love of women. David was many things. Faithful would not even be one of the descriptors that you would give him all the time. But of all of his hang-ups, would you say that David had more ladies in his life than he should have, or less?
Too many.
He had lots of ladies in his life. He had lots of children by lots of women. And his first wife was, you remember who his first wife was?
Yeah.
Michal, right? Saul's daughter, and then he started piling them on after that. He had Michal, and then he had Abigail, and he ended up with Bathsheba and a whole host of other women that he had. So to lay this charge against David, it seems off to me. But when you're looking for a proof text, many times they take something out of context. He's referring, in this passage, right here, the text that they use, he's referring to the selflessness of Jonathan. Not seeking power or position, but rather acknowledging that David's authority was from God. Okay? Incidentally, think with me, if you will, to Michal, David's first wife. Would you say that the relationship that Jonathan and David had was a more loyal relationship than the relationship that David and Michal had.
Yes.
If you think back, yeah. So in a very real sense, not a sexual sense at all, but in just a familial sense, Jonathan's love to David was in fact one of the closest and most abiding relationships that he had. So that would be the reason behind this. 1 Samuel 23 verse 17 says, "Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee." This is Jonathan talking about David. "Fear not, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee. Thou shalt be king over Israel. I shall be next unto thee, and that also Saul my father knoweth." This is their relationship. Saul is going to pass off. Jonathan knows it. We don't know when he knew that, but sometime he came to be aware, my father's going to pass off the scene. David is going to be his replacement. And Jonathan's thought was, I'll be right beside him. I'll be backing him up. And obviously, that's not what happened. Before David came to the throne, Jonathan and his father both died in battle. But that's what this passage is talking about. That's what this friendship is. It's a picture of a godly friendship between two men who love the Lord. It has nothing to do with the perversion of the world. Any questions before we move on from that? That is something. How many of you have ever heard this argument come up anywhere? Okay, it's out there and it is around, and it is something that you'd say, why would you try to prove that lifestyle from the Bible? Well, they do. On a regular basis, there are those who would claim that, well, I'm someone who practices that lifestyle, but I still love Jesus. And so they'll try to take verses and proof text that. And this is one of the ones that they look to. So if you hear it, bring it up.
What meaning of love was in the verse before? There's familial. What in the Greek? What meaning was that?
Well, because it's not in the Greek, this would be in Hebrew, so I don't have the exact. But it's not speaking of love of a sensual nature at all. In the Greek, there are three main loves. There's agape, phileo, and eros. Eros would be sexual love. Agape would be God's love for us. And phileo would be our love for hot dogs, right? All of those kind of in there. I don't know exactly what it would be, but it would not be an equivalent of a sensual love in any capacity in this verse. But I am no Hebrew scholar. I'm no Greek scholar either, but I'm really not a Hebrew scholar. Let's take a look. David's rise here in verse 5. "And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him." Why? Well, because he's Saul's servant, and he's a faithful and obedient one. Just like he went out whenever his father sent him, he goes out whenever Saul sends him. "And behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war. And he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants." This is one reason why I feel like Saul probably doesn't know that it is David who's replacing him. Okay? I think he views him as a threat, but if you knew for a fact that the guy who was going to replace you, who you did feel threatened by, if you knew who it was, would you put him in charge of your army? Probably not. I just tend to think that was not the way this worked out. There are commentators who disagree. Just from my reading, that's how I understand it. David is no longer merely an armor bearer. He's now captain over the men of war. David's popularity was increasing steadily. I think more than Saul realized at first. It says that he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Everybody likes David. Who likes Saul? The number is going, and who likes David? Well, that number is increasing. So in a very real sense, David's star is on the rise and Saul's star is on the decline here, as it were. Verse 6. "And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine." If you had to give the Philistine, who would you say that's probably talking about, that David slaughtered? Goliath. "That the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, with instruments of music." This was not uncommon. This was the norm. When the men returned from battle, the women would come out. They would greet the men with songs and celebration, particularly when they returned victoriously. Verse 7, and the women answered one another as they played and said, Saul hath slain his thousands. Boy, that sounds good. And Saul's head went really big, and David his 10,000s. Well, now we have an issue. Now we have an issue. Saul's ego just got dented, right? He was feeling really good. Yeah, you're right, I slain my thousands. What do you mean? What do you mean David did this? Again, there's song, kind of a call and reply between these two groups of women. We have no reason to assume that Saul had personally killed 1,000 Philistines himself. We have no reason to assume that. He was a man of war. Do you figure that Saul had probably killed a few Philistines in his life? Probably personally took the sword to it. We have no reason also to assume that David had personally killed 10,000 Philistines. Okay? They're not being literal here. We know for a fact that David killed one Philistine. Okay? He was a big one. If you want to give him 1.5, okay? He's not killed 10,000. Okay? So that the ladies are singing, they're lending hero status to the man who had killed the biggest Philistine in recent memory. So that's kind of what's going on here. And Saul responds in verse 8, and Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. Do you hear kind of a spoiled brat kind of a sound in there? I hear it really strong. They've ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? A lot of things, right? He's got some people who are excited. Would you be excited if you were an Israelite and Goliath just got toppled? Absolutely. Everybody was excited. But he's taking this very, very personally. Now, remember back when Saul disobeyed God about the matter of the Amalekites? He was supposed to kill all the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15. But he hadn't. He had spared the best of the sheep, the best of the oxen, and he spared King Agag, and he brought them back, and he erected a monument to himself, and then he ended up running into Samuel. And Samuel told him that day, among many other things, in chapter 15, verse 28, the Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. I doubt that Saul knew with certainty at this time that David was surely God's replacement. But I would imagine, in my reading of Scripture, that this was likely the first time that Saul viewed David as his number one threat. He sees David, his rise in popularity. He understands, boy, everybody likes David. Everybody likes this guy. Not me. I'm losing friends and he's gaining friends. And he knows that the kingdom has been taken away and hath given it, is the word that's used. He hath given it. That indicates past, present, or future action. He hath given it. Past action, meaning the kingdom has already, the kingship has already made the transfer. And so Saul would be looking, if you knew that your job has been given to somebody else here in this office, what would you immediately do when you go to the lunchroom? Well, wonder who got my job, right? Would be kind of the way that you would be feeling. And Saul has that same feeling as he's standing there. Who could it be? He looks at Abner. Well, kind of tight. He's my cousin. We're probably okay. Looks at Jonathan. He knows that's not the case. He's looking around. But then there's this young upstart who topples the giant. And now he's got competition. And so, verse 9, and Saul eyed David from that day and forward. To eye means to watch with jealousy. He's watching what's going on, skeptically seeing what exactly is going on here. I need to keep my eye on this boy because he's going places, and he's going places I don't want him to go. As a matter of fact, Saul attempts murder in verse 10. And it came to pass on the morrow. Boy, this doesn't take long. That escalated quickly, didn't it? Okay? Verse 10, and it came to pass on the morrow. How long has Goliath been dead? Oh, let's give it a week. Not long. We're not talking years. We're talking days, maybe weeks. On the morrow, after this union of David and Jonathan in their friendship, on the morrow, that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul. And he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. Now, we talked extensively about this evil spirit from God in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14, where it's first mentioned. We'll review it just briefly here as we go past. The evil here means just what it sounds like. Evil means noisome, wretched, wicked, harmful. But this isn't the first time that we read of this. God is not the author of evil. We know that from Scripture. God does not tempt. He's not tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. God is not the author of evil, but he is sovereign, which means he has power over all things. God is able to use evil to work his will and accomplish his ends. God proved this beyond the shadow of a doubt in Job. Satan thought, I'm going to do it. I'm going to make God look bad. And God used Satan to do his thing in the life of Job. Did Job come out worse? No, he came out better. We look at that. God used Satan to not only enhance and build Job, but we've been encouraged by it too. You think Satan had that in mind when he started down that road? Probably not, but that's the kind of God we serve. He's big enough that he can use Satan himself. God used Satan to prove Job. He used the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Romans to judge his people. And God is able to allow many things for chastening and purification. He has all throughout history. In this case, there is an evil spirit that God is allowing to work in the mind, in the heart, in the consciousness of Saul. It's not that God has a box of evil spirits in heaven, and occasionally he pulls one out and sends it to do his bidding. That's not how it works, but he allows evil to take place. But in his sovereignty, he overrides the evil intent to a higher purpose. Can God use the very worst of situations to bring about glory to himself? Absolutely. Absolutely he can. One notable difference between this chapter and in chapter 16, when we're first introduced to the evil spirit, is what it says here in this verse, in verse 10, that he prophesied in the midst of the house. So he's being afflicted by an evil spirit, and he's prophesying in the midst of the house. To prophesy means to speak, to proclaim, often under the influence of a spiritual being. This is not necessarily that Saul was foretelling the future, okay? But he is speaking, and he's very obviously under the influence of something else. In prophecy, to prophesy, you could be under the influence of the Holy Spirit, correct? We have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, all of the Old Testament prophets who did, but can also be under the influence of a lying spirit that you can speak forth. There are examples, again, in other passages of the Old Testament. Saul's prophesying, in this case, very likely the ravings of a man obviously out of control of his mind and his body. He's there in the house, and he's losing it. The same evil spirit has returned, just as in 1 Samuel 16. And the remedy to get rid of the evil spirit, what they do in 1 Samuel 16? They brought in David, because he was good with the harp. He's not only good with a sling, he's also good with a harp. So they bring him in, he plays the harp, and the spirit departs. It says David played with his hand, meaning he's playing with the harp. Verse 11, and Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. Now, we just mentioned that we said we would say Saul probably killed a few Philistines in his time. Do you figure that Saul, a man who had been in battles, do you figure he knew how to throw a javelin? Probably. You figure he was just a bad shot? I mean, to throw a javelin, we're not talking, across a field. We're talking in the house. That his mother never told him, don't play with javelins in the house, apparently. So he's throwing this out. I'm going to smite him even to the wall. Flings it 2 times. He flings it, and he misses it. How did David avoid death at the hand of Saul? Well, the same way Paul avoided death at the fangs of a serpent on Malta, because God wasn't done with him yet. God had many things for David yet to do. But it did change their relationship, as it would, right? If somebody throws a javelin at you once, you overlook it. You say, hey, look, bygones can be bygones, right? But 2 times? Really? No, it's going to affect your relationship, and it does. Verse 12, and Saul was afraid of David. Wait a second. Who threw the javelin? Saul threw the javelin, and he's scared of David. So he's not scared that David's going to hurt him. He's scared because David is on the steady ascent, and he knows that he's on the steady decline. Because the Lord was with him. Why was he scared of David? Because the Lord was with him. And not only was God with David, but it was very obvious that God is with him and God is not with me. Do you sense the frustration here that would exist for Saul? It's not just that God's with us, but he's with him more. It's God's not with me, but God is with him. David was divinely protected from Saul. But even Saul, in his addled state, he is truly touched by an evil spirit in his mind. Even in his addled state, he was able to see that the Lord's presence was upon David as it had once been upon him, only in a greater extent, I would say. We'll stop there in verse 12 for tonight, but before you leave, let me give you 2 things to take with you here from this passage. David had the hand of God visibly upon him. Anybody who was looking at David would say, this is a man who God's going to do something with this young man. What happened when Jonathan saw that the hand of God was upon David?
Accepted it.
He accepted it. Not only did he did accept it, what else? They came together, right? They saw it. David walking with God attracted Jonathan to him because why? Because Jonathan walked with God. Okay, same family. What happened when Saul saw that David walked with God? Repulsed, right? Same walk with God. It wasn't that David was one thing with Saul and one thing with Jonathan. This is just David's public face. Okay, David is walking with God. Jonathan is drawn to him. Saul is repulsed from him, and Saul tries to kill him as a result of it. This is always how it has been. This is how it was with Christ. When Christ was here on earth, some people looked at Christ and they were drawn to him. And some people looked at Christ and they were repulsed by him. We're told in John 15, verse 20, remember the word that I said unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they have kept my sayings, they will keep yours also. If you walk with God in 2021, it will repulse more than it will attract. There are more people on planet Earth right now who are not interested in people who walk according to the dictates of God's Word than are. So you need to be willing to accept what comes with it. Some people will be drawn to you, and tremendously strong relationships can result from 2 people walking with God together. But the same is also true in the opposite direction. The hatred that they poured on Christ, because he walked with his Father, and I walk with Christ, the same hatred is going to be poured out on us. Be mindful of the consequences of a visible walk with God. Number 2, God's will for Jonathan was likely not what he would have chosen for himself, is it? If Jonathan could have sat down when he was 16 years old, do you think he would have written, my dad's going to blow it, I'm going to lose the kingdom, and I'm going to become best friends with the guy who replaces my dad? You think that? No, that's probably not that wasn't his thought. But for him, he accepted and he embraced God's will for him. He didn't try. Saul kept trying to get rid of David to preserve the kingdom for himself and his son. His son, who he was trying to preserve the kingdom for, said, you know what? If this is God's way, then David can ride to the throne, and I'll be his number one fan. I'll be right there beside him. And I don't think that Jonathan was thinking, I'll be right there beside him so I can kind of edge him out. No, he says, I'm going to be right there beside him because he's God's man. Saul rejected God's will for himself and his son. And his bitter descent into madness takes chapters to record and should come as a very stern warning to us. Accept God's will. It might not be how you would have written it out for yourself, but accept God's will. Because if you knew what God knew, if you could see the whole of time, you could see everything about what's going on, you would choose the same thing that God has. Because His way is perfect. His way is best. So when we get frustrated and we think, oh, well, God's losing control here. Obviously, He didn't mean for this to happen. No, just like Jonathan, embrace God's will as what is best. Knowing, again, Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose. Take tremendous comfort in those facts. Any thoughts or questions that you have before we have a word of prayer here this evening? Take a look ahead. There's an awful lot coming. We're getting into where it's just nonstop. Soon David's going to be on the run. Next week, this week, Saul tried to kill David with a javelin. Next week, he's going to try to kill David with some unreasonable demands. So read ahead and you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's bow for a word of prayer here this evening. Our Father in heaven, we thank you once again for the examples that we have of men like David and Jonathan, and even Saul, Lord, as a negative example. I pray that we would learn the lessons, that we would allow these men and their stories to be guideposts for us in our walk with you. I pray that we would accept the consequences of a close walk with you, Lord, that the world didn't like you when you were here on earth, and they won't like us either if we're walking as we should. But Lord, at the same time as the world rejects us, we can find tremendous relationships and friendships within the family of God. I pray that we would do so. And Lord, I pray that we would accept your will for our lives, even though sometimes we don't understand it at the outset. I pray that you'd be with us now as we go our separate ways. Keep us safe throughout the week ahead. Make us effective witnesses for you. Help us to bring honor and glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen.